Okay, folks, so today's seminar is themed around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and trying to learn a bit about those goals and also to give us a bit of space, if you like, to think through what those goals might mean for our profession, how we can perhaps interrelate with those goals. And I'm opening with a global image, as this is very much thinking globally, obviously literally because of the United Nations connection here, but also I should warn you that this is very much a big picture session. So if you've logged on today thinking I'm going to learn lots of details about how to do career guidance or get a recipe book for career education, you're probably going to go away disappointed. Today we're thinking big picture and thinking about policy in relation to our profession. So that's the vibe of this session, thinking big. Now, I should say, just introduce myself. So I'm Pete Robertson, and I'm going to take you on this journey, hopefully. And I am, my day job is I'm a lecturer at Edinburgh Napier University, where we have training programs for careers advisors. We train career development professionals and have done for many years. So that takes up most of my time. I'm here today with my hat on as a NICEC fellow, and you know, hopefully contributing to the seminar program of NICEC, and hopefully helping to support you to think about this issue. I put my contact details there because obviously we'll be sharing the slides from today, and if you want to get in touch with me to follow this up or look into it any more detail, then there's some contact information for you. I can't resist taking the opportunity to remind people. I expect most of you know this already, but there might be one or two on the call who don't. Part of my role as a NICEC fellow is to have a responsibility around the NICEC journal. And recently, the NICEC journal became open access. So I'm wanting to make sure everybody knows that freely available on the internet at nicecjournal.co.uk, you can see current issues, but also back issues going back to the year 2000 of publications by NICEC fellows and by other interesting people. So a huge resource for career development is now freely available to you on the web. So do make use of it. And if you haven't seen it already, just pay it a quick visit to check it out. Okay, so that's me. Now let's talk about what we're gonna, where I'm gonna take you in this session. So this is the plan. First of all, I want to introduce the United Nations goals, of course, and give you a bit of the backstory about the goals. Then I want to talk about how we can apply them in our own field, how they can help us to think about career development policy. And I guess that's very much my personal take on it. You might have a different view. So applying it to career development policy thinking, then I'm going to highlight a couple of examples. I'll explain why these examples in due course, but I want to focus on health and well-being as a policy area and peace and justice as a policy area. So I'm going to use those two examples. Now, in between these different sections, I've put little slides in to remind myself to see if we have any questions or comments, so this doesn't become entirely a one-way conversation. We're a relatively small group, so it's not going to be a problem to get interjections and to throw in some questions and comments. It's not a huge problem if you throw me off track a little bit. We've got plenty of time to play with, and we're a small group, so we can be flexible. So don't hesitate to ask questions. You can put questions as we go along in the chat, and Emma's very kindly agreed to keep an eye on those. So at certain points, we'll visit them. In the latter half of the session, we're going to go into discussion groups. I'll get you into small groups to mull over some of the material I've given you, to react to it and see what you come back with. Then we'll have a free-for-all discussion towards the end. That's the plan for the session. So let's dive straight in to the reason you're here is to find out about the UN goals. So let's talk about that. That's our key topic for the day. And we'll kick off with the logo. You'll see that the UN have this rainbow logo, and that rainbow logo will recur in my presentation, as that's the symbol the UN like to use to draw attention to their sustainable development goals. So what are they? The goals define international policy objectives for a specific period from 2015 to 2030. So we're roughly halfway through that period now. The United Nations is attempting to identify goals that the international community should be working towards together. It's not the first time they've done this. This is the second iteration, if you like, of these global goals. The first set were called the United Nations Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015. Now, those were widely considered to be very successful, which is why the United Nations wanted to go back for another go. Now, the idea is to mobilize the world to achieve certain big picture economic, social, and environmental priorities. So that's really what it's about: economic, social, and environmental priorities. Now, one key thing about the Sustainable Development Goals, and one thing that makes them slightly different from the previous iteration of the Millennium Development Goals, is the United Nations introduced the notion of leaving no one behind and put that as a central promise. So they say that the unequivocal commitment of all UN member states to eradicate poverty in all its forms, end discrimination and exclusion, reduce inequalities and vulnerabilities that leave people behind, and undermine the potential of individuals and of humanity as a whole. Now, as a profession, we're very interested in people's potential, so that has some resonance for us. I think really the purpose behind this promise is that an awareness in the United Nations that it's possible to have economic growth, it's possible to have development in a nation that profits only a tiny minority, only a ruling elite, and leaves the majority of the population behind, or perhaps leaves a specific disadvantaged minority group behind. So the United Nations is trying to send a message to its member states that, well, it's not okay just to get richer if you're not benefiting everybody. So we have a strong inclusive theme running through the goals. Now, the next slide really is an image you may have come across. This is, if you like, highlighting the, giving you a lovely overview of the goals, the 17 goals set by the United Nations. I've had this stuck on my wall as a graphic for quite some time and have stared at it for quite a few hours as when I'm distracted from my computer. So I think there's a lot going on in there. So I'm just going to pause for a minute to let you look at it and think about it. Okay. Well, personally, I think this graphic merits more than 1 minute's mindful meditation. There's a lot going on there. But one of the things that I take from it is that I can see in these goals quite a few with direct resonance with the work of the career development profession. Some partially relevant, and some maybe it's a bit of a stretch to see a connection to our work. But there's quite a lot going on there that does connect with our world within our profession. So let's just take this a stage further. These are broad categories, really, of public policy goals that the United Nations has defined, and it's saying that this is what responsible governments should be working towards. What I want to do now is to unpack it a little bit, and also maybe to be a tiny bit critical. We might at this point be getting a fuzzy warm glow about everyone on the planet working together, and of course you know, it does help to have a little critical distance from any ideas, even if they're from such noble and reputable sources as the United Nations. So let's try and unpack it a bit. So this is an attempt at global governance, and it's a very ambitious attempt, and it's an attempt to govern the world through setting goals, if you like, to mobilize the world's population to work together towards goals. Hugely ambitious, emboldened perhaps by the Millennium Development Goals to do this. It's entirely based on consensus. So nation states got together and agreed these goals, and all of the United Nations member states, including the United Kingdom, signed up to them, committed to deliver on them. And it is the responsibility of member states, not the United Nations. It's the responsibility of member states to deliver on the goals. What if they don't? If they don't, they don't. Nobody beats them up. Nobody takes them to court. They don't get fined. It's just, obviously, you look better in international diplomacy circles if you are delivering on your commitments, but there are no sanctions for failing to deliver. It's a responsibility, not a requirement. Now, sitting behind the 17 Sustainable Development Goals on that graphic are 169 concrete targets. So each of the goals has got roughly 10 more specific, more measurable targets. Quite a lot of those targets relate to things which are pressing concerns in less wealthy countries, in developing economies. But the Sustainable Development Goals are relevant to all countries. Some of the details of the targets may be less so, but the goals do apply to wealthy member states as well, and have been adopted by European nations, for example. Now, even though there are specific targets, the goals are still pretty vague. They're very broad brush. And as a result, they're open to interpretation. Now, the more I've thought about this, the more I think it's a bit like an ink blot test. You can read things into it, and you can read into it what you want. So perhaps today I'm putting forward to you what I've read into it. I'm not the only person to have thought about or written about the Sustainable Development Goals in relation to career development, and I found it interesting that other takes on this are different. So you may well look at the goals and come away with a different message. So I think it is open to interpretation. They're not entirely separate. They are interconnected. Perhaps doing well in one goal may help you do well in another goal, or doing badly may impinge on your ability to deliver on another goal. But also they could sometimes be, priorities can be in conflict. Maybe well, okay, you want a prosperous economy, and that's a good thing to do, and you want work for your population, good things, but maybe that's in conflict with having a nice, healthy, wholesome environment that industry might bring about in environmental degradation. So the goals could potentially sometimes be in conflict, but again, it's a matter for member states, for nation states to decide how to set their priorities and how to resolve any such conflicts. And finally, the United Nations doesn't tell you how to do this. No route map to delivery is provided. So it's setting goals. It's up to you how you deliver on them. It's up to nation states how they deliver on them. Now, there are non-governmental organizations which help nation states by delving into the issues in more detail, perhaps developing evaluation criteria to measure progress towards goals. But essentially, there's no recipe book here, no route map provided. So a little bit of a critique of the goals there. Now, I'm going to suggest an alternative way of thinking about them. We could critique the Sustainable Development Goals for not being specific enough, not telling us what to do, what to work on, what to prioritize. An alternative view would be to say, well, look, that doesn't matter. Who cares? What's really important is the United Nations is trying to create a huge values-based consensus to bring about social change, and that's what's important. So maybe if you do take away a different message from the sustainable goals, but you're doing something positive with it that's broadly in line with the values here, maybe that's okay. So we could see it as a global movement for social change championed by the United Nations. Okay, so that gives you a little sense of what the United Nations goals are all about. Now I want to talk about applying them to career development and how I've maybe interpreted them in relation to career development. Now we're going to be talking about public policy for career development now. I'm aware that there's a variety of conversations you could have about policy in relation to careers. You could talk about how is policy made? How does it link to practice? How do we evaluate if it's any good or not? We're not having those conversations. We're very specific. We're sticking with the theme of goals here. The goals for public policy and linking the UN to our own field. Now, we're lucky in that there's been some fantastic work done around career development policy by people like Tony Watts, Ronald Sultana, NICEC fellows and associates, and some of their colleagues, Richard Sweet, Helmut Zeloff, other people have looked, they've done studies, international comparative studies to say, well, what are the goals that governments are setting for themselves when they have a policy in relation to career development? What do they think they're trying to achieve? So some fantastic studies done, mostly around the turn of the millennium or just after. And there's a bit of a consensus emerged from those studies that there's really three things that governments say they're doing when they have policies around career development. Three families of things that they say they're doing. And the first set of things relates to the economy, really, and more specifically to the labour market, using careers services or career development in whatever form it takes to help to reconcile the demand and supply of labour, to improve efficiency in the labour market, to maybe boost productivity by ensuring people are in roles that match their talents. So there's a whole set of economic and labour market issues that governments are trying to achieve. That probably comes top of the list. Second, we have educational goals. So helping the education system run smoothly, helping people make transitions from school to university, transitions from education into the labour market, but also perhaps ensuring there's no wastage, people don't drop out of courses because they're on the run sort of programme. So guidance to help people plan their educational pathway. And finally, using careers work to promote equity, fairness, equality in relation to gender, particularly also race, ethnicity, disability, and a variety of other social categories. Now, when I look at the United Nations framework, I can see that this maps very easily onto the kinds of things that Tony Watts, Ronald Sultana and colleagues were saying. I can see pretty clear links there. So the United Nations identify decent work and economic growth as a key priority, very much a labour market related priority. There are some other goals that relate to the economy around preventing hunger and poverty as well, but we'll stick with this one for now. So that's a pretty close match. There's a pretty close match with education as well. We can easily map on our existing ideas to what the United Nations goals are saying. There's a whole category of goals. There's a whole category of education around goal number 4. It's very much about giving people access to opportunities to develop their skills and develop culturally as well. And we also have 2 categories that map very directly onto this notion of social equity goals. The UN separated out gender, as obviously gender is a huge issue globally. I'm quite happy to leave to bundle gender together with other kinds of inequalities for now, because there's a lot of issues around intersectionality and gender overlaps with other kinds of social categories. So we've got a pretty good connection between what the UN says governments should be doing in relation to these areas and what our profession thinks it can contribute to public policy. That's fab. Now, I'm going to suggest we could maybe extend that framework and that there's some other UN goals we should think about. Labour market, education, social equity, all good as far as I'm concerned. That's the core business of our profession. But I think we can also expand our ideas to think about the environment, health and well-being, and peace and justice. The environment, so many of the sustainable development goals relate to the environment directly or indirectly. Huge issue. I'm not going to expand on that very much because we've had NICEC seminars on green guidance and environmental concerns. So that kind of NICEC's explored that issue a little bit. I'm going to park that one today, but just to recognise that it is an issue, and it's not just about green guidance. This is a whole massive area of public policy. So we need to bear that in mind, even though we're going to park it for today's conversation. What I am going to develop today is the idea of that we explore health and well-being and peace and justice as important issues. Now, I'm also going to suggest that although it's useful to divide policy up into different groups of goals, different categories, some things cut across those categories. The notion of sustainability doesn't just mean environmental sustainability, it means things which can endure over time. And as careers advisors, as career development professionals, we're not looking for quick fixes. We're looking for people to be on pathways which can sustain over time and move through a variety of situations through education into work and beyond. Not necessarily sticking with the same thing they chose as children, but maybe refreshing and renewing their careers over time. So sustainability is a concept which can be used very broadly. Social justice cuts across all of these categories. It's not just a separate category in its own right. For example, people living in poverty tend to do worse in the labour market. They tend to do worse in the education system. They have worse health outcomes and worse outcomes from their engagement with the justice system. So such social justice is a concern which cuts across all of these areas. And finally, social change. I would argue that career development doesn't simply have to follow on behind changes in society, trying to catch up with the green agenda. We can also help governments to drive those agendas forward. We can help governments to bring about change, perhaps actively promoting a green agenda. So that's kind of how I bundle this together, in a way, collapsing the UN framework into a more manageable number of goals that are more directly relevant to career development. And I'll justify the relevance of some of these shortly. At this point, I'm just going to pause and check in with Emma to see if we have any questions or comments popping up in the chat that we need to engage with at this stage.
Thanks, Pete. There were a couple of comments really about the impact of the Russian action in Ukraine and how that has adversely impacted, and also just general comment really about the sort of the big challenges in public policy, and sometimes that sort of all the goals represent a sort of if only wish list. So I think what you're doing, these were quite early on, so I think what you're doing, trying to break it back down and make it much more realistic and appropriate, feels more comfortable.
Yeah, yes, I think there is a degree of a wish list aspect to the United Nations Sustainable Goals. It is dreaming big, very on a global scale, but perhaps you have to have a dream or a vision in order to bring about change, especially if that influence is largely soft influence, as it is for the United Nations. I would imagine folk in the United Nations don't see the war in Ukraine as contributing greatly towards the delivery of these goals, and representing a significant hindrance, not least to the goal around hunger, which food shortages are resulting from the war. So that's clearly not good. Fab. Okay, should we? Shall we move on then? Thanks, Emma. I will touch in with you a couple more times as we go along. Okay, let's take this into more specifics then. So we have goal 3, which is around good health and well-being. So there's a specific goal around health and well-being. If you look at the targets that the UN sets for this, that the targets set in 2015 largely relate to things like childbirth and maternal care and malaria and AIDS, big global issues, or particularly big issues in Africa. So a lot of issues around physical health and developing nations. But of course they mean it in a very broad sense, so it does include mental health, and probably that's an area we'd be particularly interested in. Now, I started getting into writing about connections between careers and health, I know, a bit more than 10 years ago, at which time very few people were seeing much connection between them. And that has moved on. I'd like to think that had something to do with me, but I think in reality, it's got something to do with this fella. The pandemic, coronavirus, has brought about a change in thinking such that it's now pretty normal to see work and career as tied up with health considerations and health concerns. And it's not unusual to see government ministers talking about those connections. So again, we've had other NICEC sessions around this, so I won't dwell on this, but just briefly, we've seen during the pandemic some groups of workers exposed to greater risks than others. Bus drivers, for example. Some groups are more exposed to infection and can't work from home. We've seen groups losing work because they're on precarious contracts or self-employed. We've seen older people withdrawing from work in some cases, and I'm drawing perhaps on some of my personal acquaintances, because of health concerns about the workplace. We have seen not everyone doing badly, some professionals getting on quite nicely working from home and finding that fairly easy to manage. Work from home's become an aspect of professional work. We've seen impacts of isolation on workers and students, and we've seen people talking. I've seen people on the media talking about how we balance the threats to mental health of having a lockdown, making people stay at home, balancing that with the threat from the virus. Although the cynic in me thinks that sometimes government ministers who want to boost the economy by getting people back to the workplace, rather than a genuine concern for mental health. But we're seeing multiple entangled connections between health, work, and education now. So this has become pretty widely accepted. But I'm not sure as a profession we still see ourselves as delivering in relation to health as a policy area, which is something I'd like to shift. Now, we do know some stuff about health, particularly mental health and work. If there's been, huge research efforts in this area. So we know that work can damage your health. Accidents, infections, all sorts of things can happen in the workplace, but there are psychological threats or psychosocial threats to our health at work. So work and career can be stressful. That said, on balance, work is good for us. The balance of the evidence seems to suggest that work does offer psychological and social benefits, which are good for our mental health. That only applies if it's good quality work, though. If it's poor quality work, or work where we have to worry if we've got enough income to pay the rent next month, then that's not so good. So provided the quality of work is good, on balance, being in employment is better than being unemployed, because we know that unemployment is an important mental health risk factor. There's a huge amount of evidence around that. Unemployment is associated with increased incidence of common mental health conditions. We're particularly concerned about the effects of that on young people, that there may be scarring effects on young minds that are in a stage of development in the teenage years. And certainly we know that young people's engagement with the labour market, their future labour market prospects, can be scarred by long-term unemployment. Stepping back, the big picture is health is deeply associated with inequality, and socioeconomically disadvantaged groups get worse health outcomes. And to that extent, the effects of the pandemic are nothing new, because it's the same groups, it's the disadvantaged groups that are predominantly running into problems in the face of the pandemic. So our work and career biographies have an impact on our health, and that's strongly associated with socioeconomic gradients in society. So to use the words of Michael Marmot, the sort of Britain's leading public health expert, these kind of social, geographic and economic factors are, in a sense, the causes of the causes of illness. So there's a huge connection between work, career and well-being. And of course, mental health diseases tend to come as a buy one, get one free package. So poor mental health is associated with poor physical health outcomes as well. Now, I've previously argued with work based on my PhD and subsequent publications that career education and guidance can contribute to positive well-being. And actually, the kind of work we do is very much like a recovery-based approach to mental health. So putting aside thinking about symptoms, thinking about the whole person and how they can improve their lives. And there's a lot of things we routinely do in career guidance scenarios. We help people to recognize their strengths, deploy those strengths and build on them. We help them to think about the future, to set goals for themselves. We help them to build their confidence, get a sense of agency, a sense of control in their lives. We help them to work out who they are, forge their social identity, particularly their work identity. And we help to connect them with other people. We help them to build networks, build their social capital, all of which is good for your mental health. So those are some of the things I think which can happen in guidance, but of course we're also helping people to access those psychosocial benefits of being in work and learning. And that's particularly works well if it's sustainable career pathways, if they're career pathways which are personally meaningful, fit in with people's values. We're also helping them to learn to adapt to change, to cope with a transition, to develop transferable coping skills, which can help the next time a career transition is needed. So all of these help to build positive mental well-being. So a lot of what we do is relevant. But we're talking about policy today. We're not talking about one-to-one guidance. So there is an issue of I always ask, are things scalable? Can you take something where you can help one person, but can you help a lot of people? I think potentially this is scalable if the benefits of career support can be delivered at a population level or to a substantial critical cohort, like school leavers, unemployed youth. Then, you know, if we also can demonstrate there are positive impacts on well-being from the work we're doing, then what that means is career education, information and guidance can be thought of as a public health intervention. It's not just that, of course. It might not be the most important public health intervention when we can do things with clean water and clean air and all sorts of other things, but it is potentially could make a modest contribution to public health. Now, that's quite a claim, but it only has to be a tiny contribution to public health to be valuable. So I'm making a grandiose claim, but it doesn't have to be a huge difference to the population for it to be of value. And let me explain why. This is because how public health impacts work, how public health interventions work isn't entirely intuitive. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean. So in Scotland, where I am, I'm speaking to you from Edinburgh. In Scotland, where I am, there's been debates about minimum pricing for alcohol. And some people saying, well, the evidence shows it makes no difference to hardcore alcoholics. Well, let's take that example for now. Now, what you have here is the normal distribution. Now, let's imagine that this scale along the bottom represents mental health. I'll come back to the alcohol example in a minute. Let's imagine this scale represents mental health, and the further up you are towards the right, the more symptoms you have, or the frequency of symptoms is greater, or the intensity of symptoms are greater, of anxiety and depression, let's say, common mental health symptoms. So we could measure that in the whole population. So the further towards the right people are, the more symptoms they have. Most of us are in the middle somewhere. That's where most people are. But let's say in the dark blue, you're all reasonably well, and in the paler colours, not doing so well, suffering a bit, maybe meet the threshold for a diagnosis of a condition. Now, public health interventions aren't necessarily about the extremes here. Minimum pricing in alcohol won't necessarily impact on the most hardcore alcoholics. That's not what's interesting here. What's interesting is if we could just ever so slightly nudge that graph towards the dark blue healthy side, then maybe we can nudge quite a lot of people here across that threshold into health, and certainly stop them heading the other way out towards poor health. So even because of the way this graph works, even quite tiny impacts at a societal level are extremely valuable for public health. So career development would have to be delivered on a population level or on a large scale, but it wouldn't have to have much impact to be effective. So I would argue we can think about career development in public health terms without being too grandiose, and as long as we recognize it's potentially a very modest but valuable impact. Okay, so I've gone out on a limb there and suggested a few things. Let's just pause to see if we've picked up any other comments or questions along the line.
So a couple of points raised earlier on when you were talking, Pete, talking about the big picture and how it can be a bit overwhelming and distracting from some of the other things that are going on, particularly the scandals that are going on in the systems. And then there was a point around the sort of the big versus detailed goals, and feeling that perhaps decent work is an expansive goal because it cuts across lots of different things around sort of meaning, purpose, work quality, dignity, etc., not just about the labour market. And then there was a point made about what do we actually mean by work in this context as well. So perhaps not just paid work, but other things like working in the family, voluntary work, etc. And then another comment again about the linkages between goals, for example, quality education and decent work, as you were saying.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's a lot going on there. Certainly in terms of, off the top of my head, I think the decent work goal is really about economic activity rather than domestic activity. I think domestic activity is probably picked up more in some of the other headings, such as the gender equality issue, but obviously that's something as careers professionals we would be interested not just in paid activities but also in unpaid activities and their value in people's lives. A lot of issues do cut across those goals. It's quite, it is a categorization, it's a pigeonholing kind of thing, so we may well have things we want to talk about that splurge across goals, so maybe that represents a limitation to the framework. I think the framework can be useful if it's maybe helps us to steer our conversations in a certain direction. Actually, I'll pick up on that point in a minute. But it is the notion of decent work. I think one of the things that comes through in the UN goal around decent work is it's not saying give people jobs and that's all you need to do, but it's also saying those jobs need to be dignified, those jobs need to pay a salary that people can live on and meet their basic needs and their needs for dignity as well, and that might mean different things in different countries. So it's certainly going beyond just pure economic activity, or there's a whole other debate about what you mean by decent work, which perhaps we won't get into today.
And there was one other point about the CIPD's Good Working Index now includes health and well-being as one of its 7 dimensions.
Fab. Okay, that's great. I think that's fantastic. I mean, I think there's a slight, the cynic in me says there's a slight tendency in the workplace to have things like a mindfulness initiative and think that you've ticked the box for well-being at work, when really you should be thinking about the entire design of the workplace and all aspects of it to really address health issues, rather than simply running a stress management course, which places responsibility on the employees. But again, that's perhaps another debate for another time.
I think people are agreeing with you there, Pete.
Fab. Thanks, that's reassuring. Okay, right, I'm gonna move on now, and I'm gonna go out on a limb even further than I have already. and discuss something which I haven't really talked about before, and that's goal 16, peace, justice and strong institutions. So this is a bit more of a stretch, but I'm going to argue that this is connected to career development work, and we've missed a trick by not considering this in our profession. I'll pause a second, just let you read this. Here's not all of them, but some of the targets for goal 16. Okay, so it's quite disparate. There's some stuff here about rule of law, criminal justice systems, some stuff here about democracy almost, having robust institutions. I'm going to take this, as I said at the beginning, you can read what you want to into the Sustainable Development Goals. What I'm wanting to read into this is connection between career development and criminal justice that we haven't fully explored. I might go a bit beyond that, but that's the main thing I want to talk about. Now, I don't think we've really looked at this properly before. And so I don't think there's a lot of work to build on here. So I've recently written a paper and submitted it to a journal, and essentially it's saying that, well, there's little work on this, but there's 5 things if we want to explore this, there's 5 things we could use as foundations to explore this a bit further. And I've got one slide on each of these, and I'm just gonna run through what I mean by that. So first of all, a conceptual foundation. A surprising amount of career theory is relevant to looking at people's engagement in crime. There's also theory from criminology, of course, and some of that is similar to our own theory. But we can bring diverse perspectives to looking at the issue of why do people engage with crime, and maybe how do they stop engaging with crime. Even back in the 1930s, people like Everett Hughes in Chicago School of Sociology were writing about deviant careers and using the language of careers to describe people's engagement in criminal activity. We could think of crime as a rational economic activity. Maybe if jobs don't pay too well and drug dealing pays a bit better, maybe it's a bit more of an adrenaline rush and gives you a more exciting peer group to hang out with. Maybe there are rational reasons for engaging in, and maybe rational reasons for coming to a point where you want to stop engaging with it as well. Lifespan development theory is very important in our field, and it's also relevant to how people engage with and disengage with crime. There's an age curve in people's engagement with crime, and it tends to be adolescents and young adults that engage with crime, and then it tends to taper off into the 30s. So we could use developmental theory to try and make sense of how theories of career development try and make sense of how people might be helped to move on from crime. There's issues around self-efficacy and confidence. Maybe people are engaging with criminal activity because they're not confident that they can actually get a qualification, or confident that they can perform in a legitimate workspace. There seems to be in the criminology literature a big issue about identity, and of course that's something we explore in many career theories, particularly narrative theories, but not exclusively. And there seems to be some suggestions that in helping people move away from a criminal identity towards some other kind of legitimate identity, that can help people to move on. And we're interested in transitions, and it seems to be in this criminological literature, there's a interest in what brings about turning points. What are the moving away, desisting from crime? Desistance tends to be a longer process over time. Maybe there are certain key turning points, maybe getting married, maybe engaging in an educational course. So there's a wealth of theory that we can draw on, both from career theory and from criminology, to make sense of this. There's also an empirical perspective we can bring. We can look at research around desistance from crime and prevention of crime. Now, I've had a look at this, and from what I can see, the research base is pretty limited. Does career education information and guidance reduce people's reoffending? Well, it seems to be the case that if you help offenders or prisoners get jobs, that reduces reoffending. Those who get employment tend to reoffend less. It seems to be the case that training and education programs, including those which involve a career educational guidance input element to them, they tend to improve employment rates. So by inference, it does look as if career programs might tend to reduce reoffending. But to be fair, a lot of the studies don't tend to come from the UK. They're not always good quality, and it's very hard to isolate the effects of guidance. So you have to be pretty tentative about making any claims there. What's most shocking, though, is you might reasonably think that if somebody gets fantastic career education and guidance at school, then they'll have less reason to engage in criminal activity because they'll be busy and happily employed elsewhere, studying or working. There is absolutely no evidence I can find exploring the preventative impacts of CEIAG, or indeed a range of other possible social interventions you might bring about. Huge gap in evidence there. And I would suggest that's something we ought to explore as a profession, because potentially it's important. So there's an empirical angle on this. There's also a moral angle on this. It's not just about good guys and bad guys. Some groups are hugely overrepresented in the criminal justice system. People in poverty, people doing less well on socioeconomic status gradient, tends to be people of a certain age, adolescents, young adults. Massively overrepresented are people with mental health conditions, people with substance abuse issues. So it's not people who are doing well who tend to end up on the wrong side of the law. And obviously there, depending upon what locality you're talking about, there are minority ethnic groups who are not economically doing well and tend to get more caught up in the criminal justice system. We see this in the UK, but one dramatic example of this is in the United States, which incarcerates a shockingly high proportion of its population. And predominantly it's African Americans and Hispanic groups that go to prison. And we also see justice issues around the way prisoners are treated. So in some American prisons, they're privately run and prisoners are required to work. They're paid for that work less than the minimum wage. So we see a kind of a spooky recapitulation of the slavery experience, with many Black young men, particularly in prison, working for below a reasonable wage for the profits of the people who are keeping them in prison. So that's a dramatic example, but we do see huge inequalities across countries in different forms. So engagement with the criminal justice system is a social justice issue, and I would argue the career development profession has a responsibility to help people find pathways out of that system, or not to engage with it in the first place. Going even further out on a limb, I'm going to suggest that maybe social stability and security has a connection with careers work. Now, around the world, we see societies slip from stability into instability. That was quite dramatically illustrated by the Arab Spring, for example, where several countries experienced civil unrest, and we've seen it in other nations as well. Very often, civil unrest is associated with gross economic inequality, gross career inequality between different groups in society. And that's a key driver. And that's exacerbated or aggravated if it seems that those authorities that are combating that unrest seem not to represent the communities they are controlling or policing or judging. We see, even in the UK, we've seen over the years huge arguments about the makeup of the police force in London or in Northern Ireland, for example, and not reflecting the communities that they serve, and that being a festering concern that influences or helps to feed unrest. So arguably, careers services have something to contribute to increasing a harmonious society, a more secure society, by fair sharing of life chances, and perhaps not doing this on their own, obviously, but working with other agencies to encourage diversity in key agencies responsible for security, and to ensure that people have access to life chances. And we have occasionally, for example, in Yugoslavia and Northern Ireland, seen careers organisations involved with working in partnership with other education agencies to help to support post-conflict societies. So, fairly dramatic claim there, but again, let's push this up to a policy level to end this section with. So maybe we can think about peace and justice from a public policy perspective. Now that would mean, I would argue, our profession moving from thinking about this as a work with offenders, and that's a little niche group that we work with, and they've got particular needs, and we find them in particular settings. So in much the same way as we might work with travellers or migrants or people with disabilities or any other niche group you can think about. It's moving away. I mean, that's nothing wrong with thinking like that. That's fab. But we can add to that by going up a level and saying, well, actually, there's a massive area of public policy around criminal justice. We've not really talked to those people about what we have to offer, and maybe we should. And again, it's a very similar logic. As once I've looked at some of the literature on this, a lot of similar issues crop up from when I look at the health literature. Very small impacts on prevention and desistance could be very attractive to governments and to society. Again, we might be able to shift that normal distribution ever so slightly, which would have huge benefits to society. And dipping in to the literature, some of the forensic psychology literature, well, how do people move on from crime? I'm seeing very similar things. So I'm recycling my slide from earlier here, cheekily. Same sort of stuff, building strengths, setting goals, focusing on the future, developing confidence and agency, helping people to work out what their identity is, helping them to connect, form networks with people in the legitimate economy, putting them onto sustainable pathways that they care about, that they value, helping them to cope with transitions. All of the same stuff applies. So similar types of mechanisms of effect could work, working to help prevent, help people move on from crime, or to prevent engagement with it in the first place. So I see lots of resonances in that literature. Okay, one last time, I've talked about peace and justice there and made some fairly outrageous claims. So let's see if we've got any comments or reaction to that just now before we move into our last bit.
Yep, Pete, there was a bit of chatter there. I think people were talking about it'd be a great topic for a research project, and there were that sort of lack of evidence to try and fill some of that gap, and talking about whether it'd be interesting to look at the influence of family and environment, and whether that's greater than the careers input. And then talking about feedback from some projects that working on a NEAT initiative that people involved in that say that it is actually reducing the amount of young people drifting into crime. And then talking about how crime actually, to be successful in crime, you probably got to have some sort of certain types of skills, so perhaps strong entrepreneurial skills to become a successful person in the crime occupation. But then there was also discussion about how young people perhaps don't know what a careers advisor is for, or who their careers advisor is, or understand about sort of career choices. And also a note about how the work with offenders was a key part of the National Careers Service contract until recent years, but it's been taken away and prisons now individually commission support. So that's sort of hiving off of that ability to have that connection.
That's great. I'm going to pick up on that last point, and also what you said about NEATs there. I've, likewise, when I was practitioner, I came across examples of projects where young people who were, I don't know if they were called NEATs then, but were effectively NEATs that seemed to be astonishingly successful in diverting them from crime or deviant behaviour or whatever unfortunate label you want to give it. So I think we have quite a lot of anecdotal evidence around this, but the tendency is to have very local ways of addressing things, short-term projects which last a little while and then they get a bit inconvenient to deliver, so we have short-term local patchy solutions, and not so often, so you described the ending perhaps of a national approach there, when really to make a big impact on society you would need a national approach. So I think we need to maybe get beyond or persuade governments to get beyond patchy little, leaving everything to little local institutions to deliver on. Okay, right. Let's pull. In a second, I'm going to ask you to go into small groups and have a wee chat about this. I've suggested to you that we can expand our understanding of public policy goals by thinking about these 6 goals. You can talk about what you like in the groups, whatever piques your interest, whatever gets you going, but I'm going to throw in a few questions to get you thinking. Should we make a wider offer to government and to society? So should we say look, we can contribute to a lot more than just the economy and education? We can actually do a lot more than that. Is that something we should say, or is that unrealistic? I mean, we have a hard enough job getting a foot in the door with public policy around work and education. Is it going to be asking too much to try and knock on some more doors in government? Is that something we should do? Should we use this language? Should we talk in terms of does the Sustainable Development Goals give us a language that will play well with government or other sorts of agencies that we have to deal with? Should we do research based around policy goals? Should we tailor our research to fit into policy goals so we can marshal a persuasive argument and then knock on a government ministry's door and say, look, this is what we can do? So those are a few things to think about, but take the discussion where you want. Okay, so I'm going to ask Michael to put you into small groups now. So I think groups for around about 4 or 5 people, and for 15 minutes, and just have a wee chat and see what you come up with. Come back. Yeah, okay, we're recording again, and good to see you. Okay, so we're just going to throw it open to the floor. Some familiar faces and some of my recent students as well. Hi, folks. Just going to throw it open to the floor now, and you can just stick your hand up and then chip in with questions, comments, things you disagree with, things that you've started thinking about, and do leave your videos on if you'd like to talk, and you can put you are empowered to put your videos on your audio on, and first out of the blocks is Tristram.
Yeah, I mean, I've just depressed myself in that group, really, and probably depressed everyone else as well, really. But I mean, I really like your six sort of thematic areas, and I've been using everything I've been writing and trying to kind of raise it with anybody I talk to, because I think it's a much better framework than the sort of OECD 3 thing. So thank you for that, and I think it's I like what you've done more than what I've seen some other people do with this, because if you just say, well, career guidance meets all of the UN policy goals, you end up doing a lot of sort of contortion to make that work. Whereas I think saying, well, actually, there are 6 areas where we can make a really substantial contribution is a good one. I mean, I think there are others. In the work we did in Scotland, we did try and kind of pick some of the others. So some of the early childhood ones and family and so on, or other places. But I suppose what we started talking about in our group is this: how do you get government to care about this? Like, because the problem is that you end up with very like we at the moment, most governments focused around small areas. So we're in the education box primarily, and a little bit in the employment box, and they don't really think of us or anything that's in one box as having anything to do with anything that's in another box. So how do you start to say, well, look, actually, we're funded by the Department for Education, but actually we've got loads to offer to the Ministry of Justice. How do we, what kind of claim is that? And I kind of just have run up. I can't quite see the way through, other than some very big political transformation where you have somebody who kind of gets career development a big issue, but sort of fighting our way through from DFE to get a bit of money from Ministry of Justice seems like a very hard road. So I know that's not very helpful, but that's kind of what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, no, I think you've put your finger on what arguably is the biggest weakness in what I've been talking about. Is it simply too difficult to get heard, given the way government is structured into different ministries, different departments with different remits and lack of interest in thinking outside their policy silo. It's going to be hugely difficult. Where I think we could do something, I'm going to throw you a bone here. This is where I think that there might be some leverage. Is let's look at health in the working age population. If there is poor health, obviously we're concerned about the distress there, but economically that's a disaster. So there are economic arguments as well as health arguments for addressing the health of the working age population. If it's going badly, people are not productive. It's bad for productivity. If they're unemployed, that's welfare benefits costs. If they're going to their doctor, that's additional, or hospitals, that's additional costs. If they're using social care or their partner can't work because they have to be looked after, more costs. Hugely expensive. Health problems in the working age population are an economic disaster. So there are economic arguments as well as health arguments for addressing health. Now, the same applies in the criminal justice domain. If somebody is engaged with the criminal justice system, okay, that's police costs, court costs, probation service costs. Prison is massively expensive. Not to mention the costs of me having to put an extra lock on my door if one of my neighbours gets burgled. Massive costs to society. So, as well as the detriments to the immeasurable detriments caused by the distress associated with crime. So we can make economic arguments to sit alongside all of these. I think that's much more difficult to do around the environment. Our engagement with the environment, much more complex to make an economic argument there. So, but maybe not impossible. So that's I think one of the things we can do. And I think the other thing we can do is research evidence doesn't necessarily answer all questions, but if we develop a research evidence base in a way that can support these arguments, then that maybe gives us a tiny bit of extra leverage as well. Any more for any more? Who else wants to chip in with something you've been discussing in your groups or something that's come to mind? I think Nikki's, well, Nikki and then Siobhan. Nikki first.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I mean, I've been in a very privileged position recently. I've been involved in teaching students on a Kenyan program on career guidance. One of them's in the group today. And what has really been so interesting to me is that the students automatically refer to these goals in a lot of the conversations that we're having within our sessions, whereas within the UK, it's not come up at all. The students, you know, when we're discussing how you view a variety of different policy initiatives or theories, they don't mention the goals at all. And it's really interested me that in Kenya, they are such a powerful tool and framework that everybody kind of acknowledges and uses to think about this. And in fact, have been used. Edna in our group was talking about how she's used it to think about careers education and how to use the idea of good work as a way of helping young people think that actually all over the world people are thinking about how to do this, and it's a real motivator within her career education program. So that's really interested me, that they can have such a practical use in the programs that we teach, as well as in the way we view policy initiatives. So what I've gone away with an action point to really think about how I can integrate this in my program in the MA in careers education and coaching as a way of helping people kind of, you know, use it as one of the frameworks, one of the lenses that we examine things through. So I've got a task here. I think it's been really, really helpful.
Fab. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe some governments are more into it than others. I think I noticed the Scottish government seems to be more explicitly linking what it's doing to the goals than perhaps the UK government, particularly the leaving no one behind idea. So yeah, fab. Thanks, Nikki. And Siobhan.
Just very briefly, thanks, Pete, for that. I thought it was really interesting. And I think, you know, what you've been able to demonstrate, I think, really articulately is something I think that, you know, some of us have been around for a long time have known that, you know, career support isn't just about education. It is much broader, and that we can make a difference, but it does come back to the evidence base. You know, we have got some really good, we did have probably 20 years ago, maybe less so, but things like prescriptions for learning, where programs, you know, were able to evidence people engaging in learning, self-efficacy, career guidance, became less dependent on prescription medication. I think the challenge for us is to try and pull together some of that evidence and actually present it in a way that might be more meaningful. I mean, you know, what you were talking about in those economic arguments, you know, things like Windfall for Change, you know, which Phil Jarvis did 20 odd years ago, Deirdre Hughes did it, Tristram did a version of that, sort of the economic benefits of guidance. And I think it's trying to synthesize those debates and just represent them in new ways that is, you know, fortunately using government language, but may, you know, pick, you know, the zeitgeist, depending on where government is going to next. That's assuming they've got a plan, which I doubt. But there you go. So the cynicism in the end.
Don't tempt me. Yeah. Yes, I think it's partly about generating evidence. It's also about collating and marshalling that evidence into a package that speaks to policymakers, which is hugely difficult, but an important ambition. And I think, you know, one of the things, and we need to wind up in a few moments probably, but one of the things for me is the UN are setting these insanely huge ambitious goals for the planet. You know, Why can't we set some very big goals for the profession? If some of these things seem out of reach, well, maybe they are a bit out of reach, but perhaps we could move in that direction and achieve something from that. There's one thing I want to flag up is I think we're quite late jumping on the Sustainable Development Goals bandwagon, because we're halfway through the period. Yeah, the 2015 to 2030. I'd be willing to bet there's going to be another iteration of them, 2030 to 45, and we don't have to be late for that bandwagon. We could be early for it. We could be ready for that, and when it comes, communicate very strong and clear to government and time it around the time they are thinking about that, and use that as a lever to have a bit more influence around policy in, what's that, 7 to 8 years time. So I think we need to be ahead of the game next time rather than trying to catch up. Any more before we wind up? No? Okay, I just want to flag up, I'll see if I can show you. I've done a briefing paper for the CDI, which sums up, so if you're wanting, more readings or resources to explore this a bit further, there's a free briefing paper you can download from the CDI around this. So do check that out if you're interested. And other than that, thanks very much for coming along. If you're not already a NICEC member, you've probably learned something about what we do in NICEC today, and maybe you want to think about becoming a member and tapping into seminars on a variety of topics. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks ever so much for coming. Thanks for joining in the conversation, and we'll call it a wrap at that point.